Hello, and welcome to now episode 6 of Taking Back the Narratives um, podcast called The Zionist Corner. We are not PC and we delve into all the topics. So, welcome so much to my honored guest, Jeffrey Weiss, who is the co-author of a great book called s- uh, s- uh, Fighting Back, the story of Stan Andrews and the birth of the Israeli Air Force. So thank you so much, Jeffrey. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Great. So if you can tell the audience a little bit more about yourself, what made you decide to even write a book about the Israeli Air Force? Did you have any personal connections or interest to the Israeli Air Force itself, or just in general to aviation? We would love to know.
Sure. It's funny. Absolutely, I have no connection personally. But for me, I lived in Israel for 2 years in the 1980s. The second year, I did a year of law school at Bar Ilan in the regular Hebrew language program for Israeli students. Passed all my classes, but then decided to go back to the States to finish law school there. And I always worried over the years that I would lose my Hebrew if I didn't do something significant to keep it up. So the thing that I chose to do was to read as much as I could in Hebrew, and I really focused on military history, which was always a fascinating subject for me. And came across in 1995 a book about a man named Danny Shapira, who at one point was the chief test pilot of the Israeli Air Force, and he wrote about all of these American, Canadian, South African volunteers who really dominated the ranks of the Air Force in 1948. And so it occurred to me that if that story was as interesting as I thought it might be, 1998 would be the perfect time to have a book come out about it, Israel's 50th anniversary year, and so set out to do just that, and was successful in doing that with my brother Craig. And in the course of that research, came across the story of Stan Andrews, and the two of us were so fascinated by it that we decided to do a separate second book, just telling his unique story.
No, and that's so great because I feel like the population in general, of course, knows about the strength of the IDF. And so the focus so much, I believe until I'm speaking as a millennial, like my generation, until this war, which was post the Judean genocide that happened on October 7th, as we know, 2023, is on military might and on our the soldiers, which they are obviously one of the best. I would say I would put the IDF as perhaps the second or third most powerful military in the world. However, the IAF would then raise, again, in my opinion and many others' opinion, to maybe right after the US in terms of power. We saw like what they did in Iran, closing skies in Saudi Arabia, uh, domination over nearly all of its enemies right now. And like you said, this goes back to the beginning of post-liberation Israel. So we're going to unpack a lot today in this course of the podcast because so many anti-Semitic lies are spread, right? Like Jews, before, of course, people lie like, oh, before Israel was created, we know that Israel was not created, Israel was liberated on the backs of brave Jews who were fighting the British occupiers for over 20 years. And so I know that a lot of people don't look at Jews in our historical past as being warriors. But that's exactly how we started. We emerged literally from the Semitic tribes in Judea and Samaria. And how did we expand our land out from Judea and Samaria to include the rest of Israel? It was not by asking nicely, it was by conquering other tribes. So at every stage of history in the past 4,000 plus years, Jews have used what was available to our people as weapons and use it to the best of the ability. We see in history that our enemies up in Syria, at one point, the Arameans, that's how Israel even obtained the Golan Heights. It was King Omri, the king of Israel, against the Arameans. And he was complaining in tablet form, that Jews are having more chariots a weapon at the time than any others. The Jews were coming in with 2,000 plus chariots, an army of thousands and thousands of people. We know that during the Holocaust, right? Like the infamous line, Jews were like sheep to slaughter, and that's highly anti-Semitic. I hate when even Jews say that, and it's like no, Jews were stealing guns when they could. Beitar organized the Warsaw Uprising, and also a lot of people don't understand that many Jews fought valiantly in World War One and of course in World War Two. 500,000 American Jews were fighting the Nazis in World War Two. And of course, we know that many Jews from Palestine, Israel, were also fighting the Nazis during World War Two. Many of them were sent across North Africa, in Italy, but there were some very unique Jews, and I believe, of course, Stan Andrews among them. Dan, you can correct me here. Dan Topolowski, who just passed.
Tolkovsky, he just passed away.
Yeah, he
Yeah.
just passed. He was also in the business of taking post-World War II airplanes to help Israel in its post-liberation achievement. So my question is, so we know that for 20 plus years, Jews obtained liberation through not the Air Force, because there was no Air Force, but through guns and grenades. Um, that's how Israel was actually liberated. So, but there was a very quick turnaround time from my research from liberating Israel from obviously the British occupiers, where Air Force was not used, and then Israel was attacked by six Arab nations immediately after Israel declared liberation, after it was, of course, earned. Where does the obtainment of the Air Force come in such a quick time? And were there countries that were helping? Were there networks of Jews that were in the background? So a little bit of I guess an explainer would be helpful on that.
Sure. Basically, the British announced that they would be leaving uh, Palestine, which of course then became
Yeah.
Israel, that they would be leaving on May 15th, 1948, which was a Saturday. And so the Jewish Agency decided to declare independence, and they advanced it by one day so as not to do it on the Sabbath. So on the afternoon of Friday, May 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion gave a speech and proclaimed the independence of Israel. And the attacks began that night, and the invasion began that night. Until the British left, Israel had no ability to create a modern air force, had no ability to create, for example, a fighter squadron, bomber squadron, things of that sort. But efforts had been underway to prepare, knowing that there would be war once Israel proclaimed a state. A squadron of transport planes had been purchased and smuggled out of the United States in the spring of 48, and efforts were underway to purchase fighter aircraft. The only country that was willing to sell them to Israel was Czechoslovakia, then known as Czechoslovakia, and those planes were made available I believe in April and certainly in May for training in Czechoslovakia. And the first of those planes were deployed in combat on May 29th, 1948. Four of them were sent out to attack an Egyptian column that was proceeding without opposition toward Tel Aviv, was within 20 miles of the city when it was attacked, strafed by these four fighter aircraft. So until that time, Israel really had no defense in the air. The Egyptian Air Force was bombing Tel Aviv with impunity. There was a horrific bombing of the central bus station that killed dozens. But on June 3rd, one of the new Israeli fighter pilots, a man named Modi Alon, shot down two Egyptian C-47s that were attacking the city, and that pretty much put an end to these unopposed attacks on Tel Aviv.
Right, and that's very important. And just to add, so the British did not just declare to leave. The British were humiliated and forced out after the Sergeant's Affair that happened in 1947, and when the Irgun hung two British officers near Netanya. And that's when the British realized that this is just going to escalate. And so so Jews forced the humiliation of this surrender of the British. So just wanted to clear that up for the audience that it wasn't just the British being polite and deciding to end their illegal occupation, which turned illegal after 1922 when Churchill violated the British mandate, which was nothing more than a legal promise, when he stole 78% of the Judean homeland, renamed it to Transjordan, gifted it to the Arab occupiers, and also issued a series of anti-Semitic white papers, which then, of course, drove the final Hitler's final solution. And so there's a lot more information on that and how the British actually are just as culpable for the Holocaust as Germany. So just wanted to fill the audience in on that more historical information. Um, were there any precursor organizations to the IAF? I read about something called Cheroot Air. If you can talk a little bit more about that. Did they operate at all before liberation or during? And when the IAF first launched, what was the initial operational goal for the organization?
The Haganah had an air service, Cheroot Avir, and it had just a handful of single-engine planes, Piper Cubs and Austers. And they just use them in to fly people from place to place as necessary, but no real military capability for those planes. When the Israeli Air Force was established, it, I think, had essentially two goals. One was to defend the nation's skies, which first started to really do effectively in June, and the second was to provide close air support to ground troops, and that was something that that the Israel Air Force of that time did not become truly proficient in until perhaps October of 48 during something called Operation Yoav, where more effectively the Air Force was able to launch a preemptive strike to set the stage for ground operations in the south against the Egyptians. But those are really, I think, the two main goals.
Right. And that would make sense. Just to go back a little bit to Czechoslovakia, I just had this pop in my mind, is that Czechoslovakia at the time obviously was part of the USSR. The USSR was first very pro-Israel because they wanted Israel to be a communist vassal state. But then, of course, in 56, Israel pissed them off, right, by the Suez Canal War. That was one of the reasons, and of course, Israel siding with the U.S. And so the USSR then realized that, Israel's not going to toe the line, and we're going to do everything in our power. We're obviously funding the Arab states to then attack Israel, happened in 67, as most of our audience probably knows, but also launching the greatest anti-Semitic propaganda campaign that's still unfortunately in use today, Operation SIG, where they lied that the Arab occupiers are indigenous to Israel, the indigenous Jews are the colonizers, they're white Europeans, and on and on and on. So my question is, in 48, when Czechoslovakia was giving some airplanes to Jews, was this still when the USSR was figuring things out with Israel, like, which political wind is it going to fall on, or was the local Czechoslovakian government sort of going behind the USSR? Do you have any details
It,
about that? I'm just curious.
it seems clear from everything I've read that Czechoslovakia only agreed to sell weapons upon receiving a green light from Moscow to be able to do that.
Mhm.
In terms of why Stalin gave that green light, I think it was considered initially that Israel's establishment was a blow against
The US, right?
Eastern powers,
Yeah.
Britain and the U.S. And I think there probably was some hope that it would be more Soviet friendly.
Mhm.
There were even some within the American intelligence establishment that were speculating that Israel might become communist dominated. And so I think there would have been some basis for perhaps believing that Israel would develop in that fashion, though of course it did not.
Right.
Um, but yeah, I think those were that was, I think, the calculus on the part of the Soviets.
So it was in those intermarried years, of course. Okay. And then also you mentioned America. So I know that, of course, Truman recognized Israel, but they were against arming Israel. So do you know how, but of course we know that there were Americans who were helping the Air Force. Do you know if that had to go through government approval or was that more independent?
No, basically, so there was an arms embargo to which the U.S. Very much adhered on sales of weapons to the region and to Israel, including, of course, to Israel. There was also and the U.S. government actually banned American citizens from going to Israel to fight. And so those who did so were actually at the time risking their citizenship. And there was significant fear on the part of many that they might actually lose their citizenship as a result of going. Some
Interesting.
actually used assumed names while they were there. Stan did that for part of his time in Israel. There were weapons that were purchased in the U.S. and smuggled out of the country, but the U.S. did not give licenses and did not approve any of that. And in fact, there was a criminal trial. I guess there were two criminal trials after the war. One related to the smuggling of three B-17s, and the individual most responsible for that was actually sent to prison for about a year.
Oh,
And there was a second one in Los Angeles related to the smuggling out of these transport aircraft that became the transport squadron of the Israeli Air Force, shuttling back and forth between Czechoslovakia and Israel, bringing weapons and trained pilots from Czechoslovakia to Israel.
thank you for filling that in because I personally have not read that. So it's great to have more insight. And so, how is the IAF able to integrate to the overall IDF structure and operational strategy during what they, I know that technically it's called the War of Independence. I personally call it the War of Survival because Israel had already been independent, although albeit very shortly, but it was already, that's what people also don't have a clear understanding of, that Israel was not fighting for independence from any Arabs. They were fighting independence from the British occupiers, and they were fighting against annihilation attempts of the Arab armies. So there already were very established units, right? Like you had, of course, the Haganah, you had the Irgun, you had Etzel. Of course, right before the war, they came together begrudgingly, but they did come together. And then you have the addition of the IAF. So where does that fit in, and how did they coordinate all of that?
Um, I think during World War II in the U.S., the Air Force was actually part of the Army. It was the
Mhm.
U.S. Army Air Forces,
Right, right.
and then later became an independent branch of the U.S. military. In Israel, the Air Force did actually start as an independent branch, but truly was not an impactful.
Mhm.
Certainly, at the beginning of the war, was not an incredibly impactful branch, other than its bringing in of weapons, which was hugely important. And then over time, as the fighter squadron, the 101 squadron, became a more potent fighting force, and then with the smuggling of these three B-17s, actually Israel ended up having the only heavy bomber squadron in the entire theater of operations for the duration of the war. So I think the Air Force became more and more relevant as the war progressed, but not so much perhaps at the beginning, other than that one raid on the Egyptian column and the shooting down of those planes in late May, early June.
So essentially, they didn't have the luxury, of course, of having formalities. It just the Air Force was being used where it could, providing cover, of course, during essential operations, and they did what was best given the
That's
limited
correct.
resources and personnel that they had. And so, where did the first, this has always been on my mind, where did the first pilots and even the technical personnel come from? And what about the unique role that foreign volunteers played? We know that they did in the early days of the IAF.
Well, that's the thing. I think for the Air Force, overwhelmingly, it was staffed by foreign volunteers.
Mhm.
There were a handful, a very small number of Israelis who had served in the RAF. Modi alone was one. Aaron Remez, who was the first commander of the Air Force, had also served as a sergeant pilot in the RAF and actually took part briefly in the Battle of Britain. And there were maybe Azer Weitzman as well, and I think one others. I think Sandy Jacobs as well. But otherwise, they needed to bring in folks from outside of Israel who had been trained on frontline military aircraft and who had combat experience. And that was not something that you could, essentially train somebody overnight or in a matter of weeks to be able to do. So they brought in people like Stan Andrews, uh, who had extensive combat experience, and they created uh, the first fighter squadron, the 101 squadron, the first heavy bomber squadron, the 69 Hammer squadron, medium bomber squadron, the 103 squadron, the transport squadron, the 106th squadron, almost all of which were involved Western pilots and Western ground crews as well for the most part. And then over time, and in fact, English was the official language of radio communication
Mhm.
until I believe 1950. So very much the IAF got its start with the help of these foreign volunteers, and then progressively it became more and more of a pure Israeli force, and was able to move forward without the need to rely on foreigners.
So initially, what would you, as an educated guess, say was the percentage of foreign volunteers in the IAF? Like, would you say 80%, 90%, even
Probably
higher?
closer to 90%.
Wow. Okay. So
Yeah.
pretty much made up the bulk of it. So of course, Santa Andrews is the subject of your book. So I think this would be a great time to educate myself and the audience, his background. How did he even get involved with this he Herculean
Mhm.
mission of even aiding and starting the IAF, which was desperately needed, just to give a little bit more of a background on him.
He was a fascinating individual. He was a bomber pilot in the Pacific Theater in World War II. Flew B-25 bombers against the Japanese. He was a very assimilated Jew. Never bar mitzvahed. Uh, never set foot in a synagogue in his life. Um, but became very radicalized by the anti-Semitism that he encountered in 1940s America and during his time in the U.S. military, and realized that what was going on in Israel was historic. Realized that there would be a war, and that a Jewish state would only be established if there were those who were prepared to go and fight to make sure that it didn't get destroyed. I think truly in the spring of 48, there was the very real potential of a second Holocaust 3 years after the end of World War II. And so he decided that he would go. And he was a fascinating guy. He was an artist, he was a writer, and he also wanted to try to record the war, recognizing that history was going to be made. And so brought a variety of supplies, artist supplies, typewriter, a still camera, a movie camera, all sorts of things, and went with another volunteer, a good friend who was also a pilot and also a photographer and an artist. And so, really absolutely fascinating guy, and came with, really all sorts of ambitions to do great things and to be part of history and to help record that history.
And did he come alone, or was he part of any organization already established in Israel? How did that work?
He sought out folks who could get him to Israel to participate, as some of the volunteers did. Some volunteers were recruited, others sought out opportunities to volunteer. Stan was one of those who sought out the opportunity, and he went with a guy named Bob Vickman, who was a classmate of his at UCLA. At the time that they volunteered, also a World War II pilot, in Vickman's case, a P-38 pilot, and they went together as friends.
So I would say we have so much respect for current fighter pilots and those in the IAF. I know it's much harder, obviously, to become a fighter pilot than any other role in the military. I have a friend who actually, she's a female, she trained the fighter pilots. And she said it's like the whole country celebrates when someone even assumes that position. So I can only imagine how it felt when Stan Andrews was there. And there are no blueprints. Everything has to be figured out from scratch. You're being bombed. It's not preparation. It's ultimate, like I said, the war of survival. So people like Stan Andrews really need to be elevated, and I hope through your book as well, as true Judean heroes, and their name really needs to be known, at least by all Jews. So speaking of the technicality, What were, and this is something that I've always wanted to know too, what were the specific types of aircraft that were initially used, and how did they compare to the aircraft of the enemies who had Air Force established for at least decades at that point?
I think with respect to fighter planes at the beginning, Israel, the planes that it received from Czechoslovakia were essentially German Messerschmitts that were being manufactured on a production line that the Nazis had placed in
Mhm.
Czechoslovakia at a time when they were dispersing their manufacturing facilities to try to protect them from Allied air attacks. But those planes were fitted with a different engine because the engine factory had been destroyed, I think, as a result of a fire, and so it was actually not a very good plane. There were a tremendous number of accidents in that plane. So I think at the beginning of the war, the Israeli Air Force had was at a disadvantage with respect to fighter aircraft. The Egyptians, in particular, had better planes. They had Italian Machis and some other frontline fighter aircraft. Later in the war, the Czechs agreed to sell about 50 Spitfires that Czech RAF pilots had been permitted to take back to Czechoslovakia after World War II. So they bought a bunch of those, and those were good planes. I think they smuggled two P-51 Mustangs out of the U.S., added those to the fleet as the fleet to the squadron as well. And so I think by the end of the war, Israel actually, in terms of fighter aircraft, was at an advantage, and added to that, had succeeded in recruiting some really stellar pilots with pretty breathtaking World War II resumes. So I think by the end of the war, clearly the Israeli Air Force had the best fighter squadron, the best fighter pilots, and really had a substantial edge. I think over the course of the war, the IAF shot down 36 enemy aircraft without losing a single one in a dogfight. So it really did become a proficient Air Force by the end, not so much at the beginning.
And also, if you think about the history of training and how obviously little the Israelis got in terms of training, like we're dealing with a ragtag uh, ex-fighter pilots, who were Jews who were coming straight off from World War II, as opposed to, for example, the Arab armies that were professionally being trained by the British, some by the French. I was reading that the this is not the Air Force, it's the army, but the army itself in Jordan had something like 38, perhaps more at this point. Uh, no, I'm sorry. They had 38 British generals who were just training the troops. So you can imagine how they were training also in Air Force tactics. Egypt was being trained by the British. Uh, Iraq also. So all of them had professional army training, and obviously this extends to the Air Forces as well. And given Israel's position, it truly is very impressive what Israel was able to achieve. And I don't even call it a miracle because, I mean, on one hand, you can call it a miracle from a faith-based perspective, but I personally think when we call it a miracle, we are not giving enough credit to the incredible heroism that was behind, right? All of the military advances, the strategies, and also the executing of
There's
operations.
there's a famous quote by David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, where it was something like, "To be a realist in the Middle East, you have to believe in miracles." And years after he said that, he was being visited by an American, I believe an American Jew or a Christian Zionist, I'm not sure which. And whoever it was said to Ben-Gurion, "I really love that quote of yours." And Ben-Gurion said, "Yeah, but you have to work really hard for these miracles." And so I think there's a lot of truth in that. But I also think with respect to, whatever aircraft and trained pilots the Arab forces had in the War of Independence, at a certain level, there's an immense advantage to actually having folks behind the controls who have experience in wartime and have seen combat. And in particular, I mean, some of these pilots, there was one, Chris McGee, who fought with the Black Sheep in the Pacific. He had 9.5 kills during World War II. There were some Canadians who had tremendous records. Denny Wilson, and uh, I'm forgetting the other one, but had incredible records flying in their case in Malta. So bringing in people like that, and which also points to the fact that not all the volunteers were Jewish. There were some non-Jewish volunteers as well who did some pretty tremendous things. One of the A guy named Jack Doyle shared uh, honors with a guy named Rudy Gargarten in terms of the most kills by an Air Force pilot in the War of Independence. Each of them had four. And Jack was a Canadian Christian. So it was a very lot of people, mostly Jewish, but not all, and some with pretty extraordinary World War II military records.
Exactly. We have to be grateful for everyone who helped, of course. And so, in terms of, well, I just also want to add, not interject, but to add that even the reason that Jews were able to serve in World War II and before in World War I, when I say Jews, I'm talking about those who were living in Israel, Palestine, that it was all thanks to Jabotinsky, who convinced the British to let Jews serve in their units in World War I. And the British obviously were very hesitant at first. Then they acquiesced, and because of that approval, and Jews served in World War I, they learned those military tactics, more modern, military tactics, and then used it against the British occupiers. So I think that was a great poetic justice that occurred. And of course, in that, because they served in World War I, the British also needed them in World War II as well. And then that was
World
all.
War II, they actually created a Jewish brigade, which
In
saw.
World War I as well. They had
Um,
that was all thanks to Jabotinsky. So if it had not been for his wherewithal, who knows where anything could have progressed? Because the World War II training, obviously followed with the World War I. So I'm a big fan of Jabotinsky. And you mentioned Ben Gurion. Just as a historical aside, I'm actually shocked that he was a prime minister, even as the first prime minister, just because of the Altalena affair. And because of his decision, 19 Jews were killed. So I'm personally not a fan of Ben Gurion, and his Jewish agency very much worked against the Irgun and against uh, the very much expedited push to liberate Israel. So just something that I think that we should not sugarcoat about certain prime ministers. But then in terms of also, we're talking about help. What about the Judean mafia in the US? I know that they were helping to secure weapons. Were they also involved in sourcing aircraft for Israel?
no, I don't believe so. I think all the folks who were involved in purchasing and then smuggling out planes had a history in the aviation industry, and they were all experts. Candidly, I'm not so sure how much organized crime actually did anything that was truly useful in terms of the weapon smuggling and the sort. I know that a lot of claims have been made to that effect. I'm not completely sure that that's actually accurate, but certainly with planes, I've never seen any evidence that it was anybody other than folks like Al Schwimmer and the folks who are working with him who took charge of that, certainly in the U.S.
I'll send you a few links offline about the mafia securing. No, because it's great because like there's this great book called Tough Jews by Rich Cohen. Have you?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, it came out actually at the same time as our first book, I Am My Brother's Keeper. Um, yeah.
Yeah, so he goes a little bit into it, and then I'm just very interested in the Jewish mafia, just because again we need to fight stereotypes that Jews are weak and we're constantly the victims. So although I'm not promoting what the Jewish mafia did in the U.S., because also they were killing, you know how it was, they had an agreement with the Italian mafia. The Italian mafia kills Italians, the Jewish mafia kills Jews, and so they're saying at one point in the 20s and 30s so many Jews were killed by the mafia that the obituary page read like a bar mitzvah announcement, unfortunately, right? Like we don't want dead Jews. But I also very much admire them because during World War II, they were the ones beating up Nazis at the time all over the US. And the US government, as you know, was also using key figures amongst the Jewish mafia to at least attempt to kill actual leading Nazis in Europe at the time. So I went to an event with Myron Sugarman, and he did speak about their Israeli connection in 48. So I'll send you a few links about that.
Fantastic. I'd
I
love
just,
to
I
see.
just want to see your opinion about that. And for the audience, if you don't know about the Jewish mafia, definitely read upon it. It was a very fascinating time in Jewish history and in American Jewish history in particular. Of course, after they read your book comes first. So, what were some of the significant early air battles? Because part of my Zionism education course, Israel explained through the lens of history. One of the classes I very much focus on I call it the War of Survival, aka War of Independence. And so, of course, the Air Force is talked about, but not in this great detail that you are knowledgeable about. So, what were some of the first even combat missions? Stopping, for example, the Egyptian advance on Tel Aviv. I had read about that. And how effective were they in actually halting the enemy ground forces with the Air Force?
Well, I think the May 29th attack by those four Messerschmitts, which had been assembled in a hangar and had not been visible before, so they were truly a secret weapon when they were first deployed. And that Egyptian column was advancing on Tel Aviv, was within 20 miles, and there did not seem to be anything that could stop them. And they attacked, and the Egyptian commander ordered a halt and ordered his troops to dig in. So truly, that was an incredibly impactful raid. Um, in truth, it wasn't that destructive. It
Mhm.
was more, I think, the psychological effect of realizing, oh my God, they have an air force and they have fighter pilots, and who knows how many they have and what might be coming next. And so, but that was a hugely impactful raid. And together with Modi alone shooting down of those two Egyptian C-47s just a few days later, I think really brought a halt to those attacks on Tel Aviv. I think after that, I mean, there was all sorts of activity, shooting down of planes, attempts to provide close air support to ground troops. But I think that the next really serious contribution came in mid-October during Operation Yoav, and there, for about a half day, the Air Force launched a series of attacks on Egyptian air bases and other targets, uh, setting the stage for a successful Israeli advance into the Negev. And there was essentially something called the isolation belt, which was a corridor in which there were Egyptian forces there, and they were separating Israel from its Negev communities, and Israel was able to break through the isolation belt, and that was in part certainly thanks to the Air Force's efforts. So I think that was the first time that it really had, I think, a more general traditional impact in terms of helping the ground forces advance. And then there was a very famous episode, I believe in December of 48, where five or so British RAF planes were patrolling on the border between Egypt and Israel. And Israel believed that they crossed over that border and shot down five of those planes. I think one might have been shot down by ground fire. The other four were shot down from the air. And so I think that also really had a huge psychological impact in terms of showing that the Israeli Air Force had actually become a serious fighting force for that time.
The ultimate karma to go against the RAF. Were there any other prominent clashes with the RAF? I'd read about one in particular in January 1949, but of course, like you mentioned, that there were others. So at any point were there any like dogfights in the air between the RAF and IF?
That one, I mean, that there was
That
that
one.
one encounter, and there was dogfighting. But that was it. There were no other encounters that I'm aware of
Mhm.
between the RAF and the Israeli Air Force. And Israel was certainly not looking for a fight with the British. Um,
They were just
it's
keeping it to their, well, because I was thinking
Yeah, they had
the British did train the Arab army, so I just thought maybe that they also were, like part of the retribution, so to say.
no, they and it was a case of misidentification in the sense that they thought they were Egyptian planes that they were shooting down,
Mm.
and didn't realize until later that they'd actually shot down RAF planes. Um, but um, But yeah, no, there was, as far as I can tell, there was no determined effort to engage the British. It was just how things played out on that particular day.
Right, and their immediate, obviously, need for pushing back their enemies. So that those were the Arab armies. And in terms of the wars, because I had done a little bit, I have a newsletter that I send out every 2 weeks. And after Thanksgiving, I now do a yearly, in year two, a Thanksgiving list Zionism edition. So I did include a famous IAF pilot, and he was saying that in um, in 1967, after that war, he was in a plane with General Moshe Dayan, and he had said that I now consider the IAF to be the most important in terms of power of our army than the power. Then I think he said the combat forces, and then the paratroopers. So was it 67 that turned the tide with the IAF becoming that integral and that powerful, or was it 56? Just wanted to get your take on that.
I think it was definitely 67.
Mhm.
Israel basically threw virtually the entire Air Force at attacking the Egyptian Air Force on the ground in a preemptive strike. Egypt closed the Straits of Tiran, was poised to invade, and Israel successfully preempted that with this surprise attack and destroyed nearly the entire Egyptian Air Force
Mm.
within just a couple of hours. So that was a remarkable operation. There was nothing like it in 56, certainly not in 48. And so I think that was the mission. That was the day that really established the Israeli Air Force as potentially what the first commander of the Air Force had referred to as the tip of the spear. And I think if anything, it's become even more so. It's become not just the tip, but a significant portion of the spear, but not the whole thing.
No,
You're
no,
still,
of course, right.
but
But I would say like well, in terms of now modern warfare, one of the most powerful weapons you can use, especially when your enemies do not have that capability. But I just was wondering too, so we're talking about, okay, so of course there was that nascent emergence of the IAF in 48, and then less than 20 years later, now it's essentially becoming the foundation of a powerhouse in 67. Did Stan Andrews and other foreign volunteers like himself, did they stay on in Israel to then develop the IF in those decades intermediary, or did they end up leaving Israel after their missions were complete?
most of the volunteers left. There were a fair number that stayed for a period of time
Hmm.
to assist in um, training Israelis to fulfill their roles. Um, in the case of Stan, he did not survive the war.
Oh,
But he had been approached during the war to be a trainer at such time as the war would be over, and there were those who did stay for a time. There was a small percentage of the overall volunteers, maybe 10% or so, who ended up staying in Israel and becoming citizens. One of the most famous was Al Schwimmer, who uh, played a key role in smuggling all of those aircraft. He was actually convicted of a felony in that California trial, but was not sentenced to jail time. And as a result of that conviction, he realized he had no future in the American aviation industry. And so he's decided to stay in Israel. And he actually is credited with founding Israel Aircraft Industries,
oh,
which
interesting. Okay.
super important. So some Americans continued to have an impact after the war, but far and away, their main effort kind of ended with the end of that war.
And a significant effort, of course. In terms of Santa Andrews, just a little bit about his background. Do you know how old he was during 48? Was he a younger man, midlife, and old, like
He was 25. He was still a pretty young guy.
okay?
Um, he yeah, he graduated high school at 16, college at 19. In World War II, became one of the youngest captains in the American Army Air Forces. So yeah, he lived quite a he lived quite a life in a relatively short period of time.
So he really dedicated his life to fight evil, first in World War II, and then against the Arab attempt of annihilation. That there's nothing short of saying that. It wasn't just a war. It wasn't the Arabs' attempt to occupy Israel and rule Israel like the Ottomans did, like many other Muslim empires had in the past. It literally was to annihilate Israel. I know you understand that, but just to drive home the point to the listening audience who might not know that. And has there been any communication or whereabouts of his family after he was killed? Did they ever make any inroads into Israel? Did they remain in America? Are they Zionists today? Like any updates on his family?
They stayed. They were all in the States. He wasn't married. He still had
Or like,
two.
I mean, like his immediate
His
family.
parents were still alive at the time. He had two living siblings. And Yeah, they stayed in the States. There was some, well, there was a great amount of shock because only his older brother even knew that he was in Israel fighting.
Oh, okay.
He basically kept that information from his parents and from his sister. They did discover about a month before he was killed, they did discover that that's where he was. But for the most part, the whole episode was quite shocking for them, and so it was very painful. So there was some bitterness there. And Israel didn't handle the notification to families of people who were missing with the kind of grace that they are able to do that now, so many years later. So there was a lot of just grief and sadness and bitterness, um, but the family, was proud of what he had done and certainly was happy that what he did contributed to a successful effort. And he has still a living niece, and her family. They're all quite Zionistic and very, very proud of Stan and the things that he did.
And that's heartwarming to hear that at least even though he didn't have children, he has in other ways legacies that know the impact, the great impact that he had done. That to me is to me it's beyond heroism. It's one thing when you live in a country and you defend it, which is heroic on its own merit. But then, like even now, like we have the lone soldiers, right? Who, after a lot of these wars, especially after this past war, they in droves went to Israel to fight, but they also, and not to diminish what they did, of course, it's beyond heroic. So not a but, and they joined forces that are already established for decades and decades. So I cannot even begin to comprehend, even during the course of our conversation, landing in a country without the foundations of any semblance of an air force, dealing with the six armies that are not ragtag armies, which still a lot of people misunderstand. These were highly, highly trained armies and trained by superpowers. France, Russia. Then you had, and obviously this is on in 48, but then less than 2 decades later, you had the monetary backing, the weapons backing of Russia, again, a superpower of that time. And then you had Israel, not backed by the US, not helped by anyone. And yes, I give a lot of credit to the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia at that time, but that still was not enough given what they were up against. So this was just such a proud episode, and I knew that when you reached out to me that we needed to have this conversation at some point because even like I'm a proud Jew, and even I didn't know most of this, and I can imagine many Jews don't know it, or they take like for like I do, like just take it for granted. Of course, we have the IF, and I could not imagine Israel without it, but there was a time, of course, that we didn't have those capabilities, and somehow we still managed to liberate a country, and with the help of really, again, I can't underscore the usage of the term heroic people like Stan Andrews and many other volunteers to turn the trajectory around for the only Jewish homeland.
Yeah, no, it was quite a thing because they showed up in Israel and the Air Force. That there's that old adage of building the plane while you're trying to fly it, and certainly that was the case for the military at the time. It was chaotic. Not all of the commanders really were qualified for their positions, and so there was a lot for foreign volunteers to have to wrestle with. But they found a way to make it work, and it is to their immense credit that they took those risks, made that, and in some cases, of course, made the ultimate sacrifice for having done that. But I think for me, one of the things that most drew me to Stan was that he was not somebody who was brought up to do something like this, to be focused on the Jewish people, to be focused on the land of Israel, to be focused on Zionism and the return of the Jewish people to statehood. And yet essentially just felt in his bones that this was something that he needed to be part of. And he lived his truth and he made that decision. And it was certainly not something that too many others in the end were prepared to do. You quoted the figure of 500,000 American Jews in uniform during World War II. In the end, the total number of volunteers that went from North America, US, and Canada both was about 1,000. Um, and of those, a few hundred were probably Canadian. So, I think there were a great many more who would have liked to have gone, but in the end, for one reason or another, didn't ultimately do that. And so, for those proud few who actually who actually did it, I have nothing but admiration.
Of course, and also you have to think like, now we're connected through social media. We know what's going on, where the need is. Back then, right? Like maybe like most, now I'm not saying most, but maybe a great number of Jews didn't even know what was going on in Israel, right? Like
Yeah,
it was
they
still
had newsreels, like that was their, and that was, I think, one of the things that got some volunteers motivated. They saw a newsreel of the British boarding the refugee ship Exodus, and that made the rounds. And there were Exodus crewmen who came to the States and gave talks about what had transpired. But yeah, I mean that was a prime source of news back then. Was the pre-movie newsreel.
and also like having come back from war, from combat, probably dealing with their own PTSD, like trying to integrate back into their society. So yes, like you said, like the few, the collective few who went on to aid in Israel's victory is just absolutely outstanding. So you can't help talking about 48 and the growth of the IAF to the absolute powerhouse it is in 2025. And so one of my questions throughout this war. I mean, to me, the war is not over. Ceasefire this, ceasefire that. Israel's still bombing in Lebanon and Syria because we have terrorists who actually truly run those countries. And no ceasefires are going to be adhered by them. So when we were losing troops in Gaza, doing the urban combat, fighting door to door, fighting Hamas who was not in uniform. And also, to me, it's so frustrating that people don't, and I'm not saying Jews, but the greater society does not even understand that all of the Arab occupiers in Judea and Gaza, and I keep saying Judea and Gaza, why? Because legally and historically, it is Judean land since 145 BC. It was upheld as such at the 1920 San Remo Accords of 1920. Even after Churchill stole 78% of the homeland in 1922, Gaza and all of Judea and Samaria remained part of Israel legally. It was again upheld as such. I'm sure you know all this. I'm just explaining to the listening audience. In 1922, it was codified by 51 member states of the League of Nations. And Article 80 of the UN Charter upholds all of the League of Nations treaties. So to this day, Gaza still belongs to Israel. And who lives in Gaza? Most of them are Egyptian occupiers. Egypt settled in initially over 250,000 of their residents, of their residents and radicalized them. The most popular last name in Gaza is Al-Masri, the Egyptian. And who joined them were some former Israeli Arabs who only moved to Gaza to help the Arab armies kill Jews faster. They didn't even move there for safety. They literally moved there like, oh, okay, the Arab armies are telling us to leave our homes for 2 weeks. We're going to drive Jews to the sea and we'll be back. That's the only reason that they moved. That's who lives there. That's who elected Hamas. There was no takeover of Hamas. There was no civil war of Hamas. It was a landslide election. So we can say that all of Gaza technically is Hamas. There is no one singular entity called Hamas. Then you have Judea and Samaria. Hamas is a stronghold with the Arab occupiers there as well. So my frustration during this war, when I kept seeing the escalation of casualties of the IDF, my thing was, okay, aside for, of course, the hostages, right? Because like we can't bomb all of Gaza because then we're going to kill the hostages as well. But how much more, and again, you can be honest, of course, in your opinion, we're not a PC podcast here. Do you think the IAF was used properly in Gaza, or do you think it was, I'll say it this way, do you think it was underutilized? And the onus of on-ground troops could have been less. Agree, disagree? I'll just throw it out there.
I mean, my sense has been that the Air Force was used very effectively in Gaza, in close air support of the ground troops and bombing strategic targets. Um, I hindsight is 2020, but I don't know that there's much more that could have been done to spare the ground troops. I think Israelis, wholly apart from what Americans or Europeans think, I think take a lot of pride in the fact that Israel is very targeted in its operations and really
Mhm.
does make a determined effort to separate combatants from the non-combatant population, and really makes a determined effort to kill combatants and as much as possible, where possible, to spare folks who are not carrying weapons. I think that's a point of pride for Israelis. I don't think it's something that Israelis necessarily chafe at or embarrassed by. And certainly, I think Israelis don't need prodding from outsiders to take great care that they are targeting the people who they should be targeting.
I think it depends which Israeli you talk to. I know like from again, like speaking from my generation, there is a shift because it's not indiscriminate bombing when the entire population is Hamas. It's the same population that cheered. The children, the women were cheering when the murdered bodies of our hostages
Look,
were
it certainly was a very, yeah, I mean, look, an
yeah.
extraordinarily hostile population, but I still think that Israel made a determination that we are going after people who are carrying weapons, and we're not going after people who are not part of a an armed force, hostile or whether they're hostile or otherwise. And I think, from my point of view, I think that was a good decision, and I think it's a decision that that makes Israelis feel good about their army, about their country, about their approach. There's that the motto of the Israeli military used to be Taharat Haneshek, a purity of arms. I think that's taken very seriously here. And it's funny. I mean, I live in Israel now. I moved here in 2022. I have yet to hear of any Israeli of any note who is has expressed joy or happiness about non-combatants being killed as collateral impacts of strikes on military positions. It is something that happens. I think, John Spencer from West Point has written incredibly powerfully about how effective, extraordinarily, the Israeli military has been in separating and targeting its operations against armed combatants. Um, and I think Israelis are proud of that fact. And as a newly minted Israeli myself, I count myself among them. I think it's a good thing that Israel is effective, and it uses its air force, I think, in an incredibly strategic, uh, focused way, and I think it's pretty remarkable.
So I'm going to push back a little bit in terms of, okay, because if we're talking about army to army, then yes, like if we're going into, let's say, Iran, which happened, those were and had to be incredibly precise strikes only against the IRCG, of course, because the population itself, 80+% of the population are not terrorists. They are actually very pro-West, they're pro-Israel. Even Lebanon, right? Like actually most Lebanese do support Hezbollah. And something that a lot of people don't know, Hezbollah is not just Muslims. They also include Christians in Lebanon. And the Lebanese army is infiltrated by Hezbollah. So you can talk about, like how much of blending there is of population support versus the terrorist organization. But when we're talking about Gaza, and even when we're talking about Judea and Samaria and the Arab occupiers in those two places, they are Hamas. Like they said, you can kill 100 terrorists, they're going to be replaced within months. And that's actually what Hamas did. When they lost 30,000 fighters, it took them no time to replace those 30,000 terrorists because they're taking them from the population UNRWA. Where is all the brainwashing coming from? It's coming from, UNRWA schools. Those are also that also is a terrorist organization. So the pushback that I'm hearing, even from Israelis, again, the Israelis that I talk to, is that we sacrificed too many soldiers when the IF could have done a little bit more. And this is not against the IF itself, but against government missives, right? Like how to use the IF, especially after the hostages were released, in bulk, like now. And now what we're facing a terrorist third state within Israel. We already have one, which is Jordan, 78% of, the Judean homeland. Uh, to say that Jordan does not support terrorism is pure naivete. I've been to Jordan. I've seen the difference between the Bedouins, who are all genetic Jews in Jordan, Israel East, and in Israel. The difference between the Arab occupiers, who then were moved into Jordan. They all support Hamas. The Jordanian government does funding for terrorist organizations. Then you have the PA, as you know, also a terrorist organization in two-thirds of Judea and Samaria. So now to have Gaza, which is going to be rebuilt by the Saudis, going to be rebuilt by Qatar, the people who are pushing back on like, okay, could the IF have been utilized, not could have done more, but utilized more, is they're afraid that those who fell in battle in Gaza would have fell for nothing. If Gaza is going to be rebuilt and who's going to be in charge there, of course it's going to be Hamas because that is the population. So it's a push and pull in terms of geopolitics, and of course in terms of military tactics, and sometimes Israel wanting to please the world like a little bit too much and showing like, oh, like we're going to all these careful measures, but the world, even America, is not dealing directly with what Israel has to deal with, right? Like when we go off to fight terrorists, they are thousands and thousands of miles away. It's not in our backyard so far. Hopefully it's going to stay that way. So it's a very different understanding of policing Israel's military maneuvers. I'll leave it at that. So yeah, like, and I agree. Like, yeah, there are Israelis who are very, thrilled that Israel kept military strikes at a minimum, and there are others, and Jews here as well, who have mixed opinions on that. So yeah, and it's okay. It's okay to agree to disagree, about that. And at least we have a very strong IAF that, look what we did in Iran.
Yeah, no, it was
Never.
extraordinary. I
It's
think,
absolutely.
yeah, to fly all those missions without losing a single plane so far away, all of those aero refuelings, and not even losing a plane to an operational accident, which I think candidly was
Like,
expected.
yeah,
Um,
because it could have
and
been.
so, yeah, I mean, I think that was to this point, I think the apex of what the Israeli Air Force has shown that it's capable of doing, to fly so far against, a country with a very, very strong air defense system, and to really obliterate that system, and then to selectively take out some incredibly strategic targets, the nuclear sites, the ballistic missile production facilities, launch sites, and all the rest. I think that was quite remarkable.
So I do have a few Iranian friends in Iran. We communicate obviously very sporadically, obviously only online. And I'm not going to go into details, but they've said that there are quite a few IDF who have remained on the ground, and they are in very close, I would say, training with Iranians. And so he predicts that this is him, an Iranian. He predicts within years the regime is going to fall, and Israel and Iran are going to be close friends again, as they were before.
Look, it's possible. I think that, especially with the water crisis that they are
Yeah.
experiencing there now, I think, and the deep unpopularity of the regime to begin with, I think almost anything's possible. I think perhaps the bigger question is not whether the regime of the Ayatollahs will survive, but what will replace it.
Right.
Um,
Well, I'm actually very, again, this is my opinion. I'm very positive of what's going to replace it because and I voted for Trump, but I disagree vehemently with him barring Netanyahu from assassinating Khomeini because this is one of the few instances where getting rid of the leader would topple the regime. Like there is no replacements. I mean, yes, like they can name a replacement, but they're not legitimate in the eyes of the population, and that would give very much fervor to the Green Movement, which should have been funded, by the way, by Israel and the US for years. It should have been funded 10 years ago. And I truly believe had Israel given the Green Movement weapons and money, who knows, a lot of this could have been avoided. But again, like we're playing Monday night quarterback as you know, as happens, right? Like no one knows in the moment what's going to happen. Although I did say when the Green Movement was gaining ground, gaining traction, someone needs to fund them. Israel, US together. And I feel like sometimes the US competes with Israel and doesn't work actually together with Israel in terms of geopolitics and in terms of Iran. Uh, Again, a lot of the consequences, I think, at least not maybe averted, but could have been minimized had more confidence been given to the Green Movement. So there I'm very, very confident. But I do also want to give credit to a few Arab countries that were given air cover for the IAF to even be successful in Iran. You know, like the Saudi Arabia was one of them. I do want to push back because Saudi Arabia was gloating that remember when Iran was sending launching missiles towards Israel and they said like, oh, like we're protecting Israel. No, that was not true. They were protecting their own land space, given the geographical, proximity that. So they were protecting themselves. However, during Israel's uh, strikes on Iran, the Saudis were cooperating. So you have to give them credit. Even Egypt, like Egypt didn't have to be so cooperative with Israel during this war. It could have sided with Hamas. But El-Sisi actually did more against Hamas before this war than even Israel did for decades. So I think that we have to not, maybe be grateful, but to be honest that not all Arab countries are now horrible to Israel. There's a lot of geopolitics in play, and we have to be malleable with the times.
Absolutely. No, and I think there's Iran is a threat, not just to Israel, but to a
To
lot
the
of the Semitic
region.
countries.
Right.
Yeah,
And that's actually part of the reasons the Abraham Accords were even able to be, to be ascertained was because of the threat of Iran, that they wanted that cooperation. But I do have to say that the reason that some Arab or the growing list of Arab countries wants to cooperate with Israel is because of the IAF. Without the IAF and Israel proving its military prowess, there would be no cooperation because no one wants to cooperate with a weak partner, only the strong.
I think that I think that Israel has made common cause with a number of the other regional countries against Iran, and they want to see Israel be effective against Iran. They may not want to be seen as cheering for that outcome or supporting that outcome, but I think quietly,
Oh,
um,
in the background, they most certainly are. But not even just about Iran. I'm just saying in general, like, you have this country that, again, thanks to the IAF, I mean IDF overall, but IAF, I believe in particular, they understand that their air forces are not on that level. There probably will never be on that level, even with F-35s perhaps being given to Saudi Arabia. They'll never be as strong as Israel. So why fight Israel when it's advantageous to us to join in on some level? So and again, it's thanks to the great volunteers like Stan Andrews and the history behind the establishment of the IAF that we are seeing the fruits of that labor.
Yep, very much so. Very, very much so.
So thank you so much. It was great speaking with you and learning a lot more that that information is not readily available. So for everyone listening, please, purchase Jeffrey's book. I will be doing the same. I'll be reading it with great interest. And thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you. And I will include the link to the book in the description under YouTube and Buzzsprout.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Have a great night.
You too. Bye bye.